The primary goal was to resolve through observation and sampling some of the unresolved questions about the history of the moon and its relevance to the history of the sun and the history of the Earth. For example, the ages of some of the major impact basins on the moon. These basins are hundreds of kilometers in diameter, formed by meteors or cometary impacts. Also, the ages of some of the volcanic eruptions, one of which looked to be very young based on the analysis of photographic images that had been taken prior to the Apollo 17 mission. The importance of the Apollo 17 mission as the final exploration mission of the Apollo series was that it could go to a very complex area with a geologist on board that could resolve some of these questions, or at least collect samples that could not be collected maybe anywhere else with the Apollo capabilities, that through the next many decades of analysis would begin to answer some of the unresolved questions about the history of the moon. Turns out that through the discovery of the orange soil that I made at a crater called Shorty, that very young appearing material was actually very old, 3.5 billion years old when it erupted. The Valley of Taurus Littrow, where the Apollo 17 landed, is a valley deeper than the Grand Canyon. The mountains on either side of the valley rise to thousands of feet in elevation. So you can see that it's a geologist's paradise in that you can see 3 dimensions of at least the upper crust of the moon. My most memorable moment in training was learning how to fly T-38 jet aircraft, because I was 10 years older than the normal undergraduate pilot in the Air Force, and I had to break some habits. I had to not focus on just one thing, but to learn how to scan rapidly the various data sources that you have in flying a high-performance jet aircraft, and to do it repetitively. That was a break from what I was used to doing as a scientist. As a scientist in a laboratory, or in the field, you can focus on one problem and then move to another one. You can't do that when you're flying a high-performance jet aircraft. You've got to continuously scan and integrate all that information into what is happening to your airplane. Well, launch day went very normally. We were going to launch about 10 o'clock at night on December 6th, 1972, and we got down in the launch countdown to 30 seconds, and the launch computer system stopped the launch at 30 seconds. That got your attention. And in particular, you're wondering now, does everything about this huge rocket, the Saturn V, everything about that rocket know that we have stopped the launch? And indeed it had. All of that worked out very nicely. During that 2 hours and 40 minutes, once I heard the very calm voices of the launch director come on and said, well, we understand the problem. It's going to take us a while to sort it out, and it's a computer problem. As soon as I heard Skip Schaman make those kind of very calm remarks to us, I was able to doze off and listen to the fans and the motors of the spacecraft and get caught up on some sleep. You never have enough sleep, believe me. The first rest period on the way to the moon, we don't have night or day once you're out away from the Earth, of course, but we called them rest periods. Ron Evans, the command module pilot, was on watch, and he had the Snoopy cap on, was in case the ground needed to contact us for any reason they saw in the telemetry of the various systems and components of the spacecraft. And when morning came, or when the rest period was supposed to be over, the ground was trying to wake up Ron Evans, and they couldn't do it. The first I knew about this was when I woke up, and I was underneath the couch in what NASA called a sleep restraint, just basically a hammock. And that I looked up to the caution and warning panel, and the red warning light was on. And the natural instinct you have after training for 15 months is to reach up and turn off that light by just punching it. Well, when I punched it, it was very hot, so it actually had been on for quite a while. And it turns out Ron had a problem waking up in the morning. And he had had that problem as a operational fighter pilot, and eventually put an old-fashioned alarm clock in a tin basin in order to wake up for his various assignments. And so we just took Ron off of the watch agenda, and so the commander and I were the ones that held the watch for the rest of the mission. One of the things that you notice as soon as you're outside the spacecraft and walking around on the moon is how different 1/6 gravity is from 1 gravity here on Earth. And you have to get used to that. Your spacesuit and you in it weighs about 370 some pounds. Divide that by 6, and it's something like 60 plus pounds in lunar weight. Now the mass doesn't change, of course, but the weight changes, and you have to adjust to that change in weight and to the fact that the configuration of the suit and the portable life support system on your back moves your center of gravity about 2 inches to the rear. And that is just something you have to get used to, and you do. You get used to it very quickly. And that's one of the reasons when you see films of astronauts walking on the moon, they're leaning forward because they're moving that center of gravity over their feet. Now, sometimes you forget, and that tends to cause some difficulties. Now, primarily you start to fall. Now, you're not going to fall very fast or very hard in 1/6 gravity, so it's not a big deal, and it's easy to get up. All you have to do is push against the surface of the moon, and you get to your feet fairly easily. In a couple instances, though, the video that people have seen will show that I, on 2 instances, lost track of where that center of gravity was and ended up falling several times. One actually changed the name of a crater to BALLET crater because of my antics in trying to keep my feet, and then finally just trying to demonstrate a ballet movement while I was on the moon in front of the television camera. Another instance, though, was a little more serious, and that is when the commander missed getting back on the lunar rover. The technique generally was to stand at the side of the rover and jump up with a little bit of translation and come down, you hoped, in the seat where you belonged. In this case, he caught something and fell on his back against the wheel of the rover. And that was not a good situation to be in, because it's like being a turtle on your back, but constrained in how you could move. And we were on about a 20-degree slope when this happened, so you're constrained in both directions. And I finally figured out that he was having problems, so I went over, and it illustrates the importance of the buddy system, is that all I had to do was grab his hand and help him get to his feet. I could have also picked up the rover and moved it and made it easier for him to do it by itself. But nevertheless, that was a serious situation relative to illustrating how important it is to always have somebody else working with you. The first thing that gets your attention on entry is the rapid buildup of G-forces. We actually went to a very peak G of 7 times Earth gravity in deceleration forces. That was to make sure that the spacecraft was captured in the Earth's atmosphere and didn't run the risk of skipping out of the atmosphere. That would have not been a good idea. As soon as that 7G peak had been reached, then the G-forces tailed off to about 4 Gs, and it held 4 Gs as the spacecraft maneuvered to where its guidance system said the carrier was, waiting for us down in the Pacific. Actually, the carrier was the Ticonderoga, a very famous name for a very famous carrier. And as a matter of fact, our guidance system knew where the carrier was better than probably the Navy knew where the carrier was, just because of the sophistication of our guidance programs. Well, one interesting coincidence in my history was that when I was a student at Caltech, one of my classmates was Gordon Fullerton, who ended up as an Air Force test pilot for many years and then was assigned to the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program of the Air Force. That program was canceled and Gordon moved into the astronaut program. So we reunited from J section at Caltech as a freshman. We reunited as astronauts with NASA. I call that a coincidence. And I don't really believe in coincidence, but that is. The main thing is that the observations and the data collected on the Apollo missions, the samples that were collected, are really a gift that keeps on giving. There are thousands of students, thousands of professors, thousands of researchers around, not only around the United States, but around the world, who work on these samples and learn new things almost every day. As a matter of fact, just 2 years ago, NASA released some of the samples from our mission that have been kept frozen. And those are being worked on now. I have the privilege of working with the University of New Mexico team and also a team of some 90 scientists throughout the world who are working in various ways with new analytical technology on these samples. It was a very important decision made 50 some years ago in that we would not work on all the samples. We would freeze some of them so that new technology could be applied to their analysis. And that is being done today. But also, we expect through the ARTEMIS program, the new landing program on the moon, to have more samples. I think it's very important not to be too parsimonious with these samples that we have from Apollo, in that we certainly expect to have more samples coming back from the moon in the not too distant future. If I had known what kind of career path I was going to end up on, and I did not know, I would have learned mathematics as a language. It is absolutely fundamental to everything that Apollo did, everything that I did in my career, and it would have been very, very helpful to me if mathematics and physics had been a much more important part of my academic assimilation. The other thing I would have done is probably emphasize physical conditioning, particularly my upper body. Again, I did not know this at the time, but it would have been very helpful to have much more physical capability, much more physical endurance in the Apollo spacesuit. And that's primarily with respect to forearms. When you're in a pressurized suit, you're using your fingers, and those are muscles that operate your fingers are in your forearms, and they get fatigued. The astronauts that constructed the International Space Station learned this and had specific trainers work that, and they didn't have nearly the difficulty we had on the moon with the forearm muscles. But in retrospect, I would have done a lot more physical training of my upper body. Well, the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, which was started by the Mercury astronauts many decades ago, is a very important component of building the understanding of science, technology, mathematics, and others relative to space in a new generation of young people. I think it is extraordinarily important that the scholarships that are offered by the ASF continue and grow so that there is a new generation of engineers, of scientists, of historians and others that can carry on the legacy of Apollo. And that is happening, and I certainly encourage the growth and continuation of that program. The main thing that any scholar today, if you're interested in the high technology fields, is to build as broad a base of education in mathematics and physics, chemistry, history, reading. All of these things are extraordinarily important. Never stop learning. That's the most important thing that I think we all need to do in order to make successful new endeavors in technology, and particularly in space technology. Throughout the history of earth science, field geology has been extremely important. It's where you gather the fundamental basic information and samples that then can be analyzed in much more detail than you can in the field. But a field geologist has to be able to see what is unusual as well as what is usual in the terrain that they're working in. We are fortunate for the ARTEMIS program in having another geologist preparing for flight, Jessica Watkins, coincidentally a Caltech graduate, and she, I think, will be one of the prime candidates for the early ARTEMIS missions. She's currently on the International Space Station with her first space flight. And that experience is, I think, going to be very valuable to her, but it's particularly valuable to the ARTEMIS program to have a geologist in the wings who can continue the tradition of field observation and sampling. One of the most important things we can do is to work in detail with the lunar regolith. The regolith is that debris layer that covers just about everything on the moon. It's developed over billions of years through impact processes, as well as collecting information about the history of the sun. The solar wind is impacting the moon continuously. That regolith records that energy as well as composition of the solar wind, and it has the potential, and I think we're beginning to see that potential realized, for understanding how the sun has evolved over fairly recent geologic time. For example, the work that I've been doing on the lunar regolith drill core that we took on Apollo 17 is indicating that about 500 million years ago, the energy of the solar wind increased significantly and stayed about a factor of 2 higher than it was before. That may coincide with a phenomena here on Earth that has been identified as the Cambrian explosion. Now, what they mean by that is there was a vast increase in the diversity and quantity of life in the oceans of the Earth. And it has always been speculated that it was because the energy of the sun increased and warmed the Earth so that explosion of life occurred. Well, we may now have specific evidence in this lunar regolith, this debris layer, and in the layers that are in that debris layer, that indeed that's what happened. That's one of the more exciting things that has come out of the more recent synthesis of a variety of analytical data that exists relative to the core that we took on Apollo 17. I think it's important to remember that an effort such as Apollo involved over 400,000 Americans in that effort, and they were primarily young. In fact, the average age of the engineers in Mission Control Center during the Apollo 13 mission crisis was 26. And they had already been involved in a number of other spacecraft programs, spacecraft missions. And you just have to recognize that these programs require highly talented, highly motivated, patriotic young Americans in order to make them happen. And that's going to be necessary here in the future as we face other challenges, geopolitical challenges around the world. There is one major threat to the propagation of the human species, besides what we do to ourselves here on Earth, and that is the potential of a very large impact occurring on the Earth, something like what wiped out the dinosaurs some 65 million years ago. We really ought to be well dispersed throughout the Milky Way galaxy at the least by the time that happened. It would be a good idea to continue as rapidly as possible to develop the capability to not only settle the moon and settle Mars, which are in our own solar system, but to have the propulsive capability, the technological ability, and the psychological capability to move on away from the solar system into other venues in space.